Thanks, everybody. I will do in the science panel what I will do, since we're not going to moderate this one either. I'm going to have these guys introduce my esteemed colleagues and their background in science, and we'll jump into a question or two and then kick it out to you guys on where these guys think it's going. Gio, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, everybody, again. So I'm Giovanni Venturini. So, yeah, I've been working in the biorefining space since at least 15 years. After graduating in engineering, I started to work on second-generation biofuels in Africa from non-food crops. Then I moved to the biomaterials, where I started a company called Agroils. And that company is producing bioglues, bioresins for replacing formaldehyde in wood panel production. So, and that's where I learned first time about hemp, because I was looking for protein sources to be used in the bioresin formulation. And then I started a second company dedicated to cannabis and hemp in 2018. That's Herbolea, and we are specialized in solventless extraction. We develop a number of technologies for obtaining concentrate, vape liquids with different cannabinoids, terpenes, fraction, starting from fresh material.
And what's your educational background?
Yeah, I was saying, so I studied industrial engineer in University of Florence. Then I spent a year at KTH in Stockholm, in Sweden, and a lot of experience on the ground. Just want to mention perhaps that I had as a mentor a biotechnologist that was the first inventor at Genentech. A few years ago, and I learned a lot from him. It's Professor Roberto Crea, and yeah, I mean, now I have like 8 between patent and patent applications.
Seb?
Yeah, so I started my career at Imperial College as an academic drug developer, developed a number of targeted biological therapies and span out patents that ended up becoming biotech companies. Then spent a period of time at Harvard Medical School doing similar types of research, at which point I pivoted my career into technological entrepreneurship, and then spent the last 15 years in that sort of vein, eventually bringing myself back actually to cannabinoids, primarily because what I saw was an industry that really had a deep need to be able to address complex questions, and the best process we have today for that is called science. And so from that point of view, I saw a real opportunity with the way that things had been scheduled, and also therefore grants had been blocked. Universities couldn't do the research that was required, that we could create an innovative company that could actually address or build a platform and an innovation investment system to be able to develop that early stage research and capitalize upon it. My personal interest there really comes from the fact that as a drug developer in my early career, it felt like we were developing drugs that blunted and kind of dampened the issue rather than found real cures. And cannabinoids were interesting to me for a long time, primarily because they still didn't teach them, and they still don't teach them in medical school. But they interact in a fundamentally interesting way in the fact that they interact with the brain, the neurological system, and with the immunological system. And it gives you an incredibly new way to think about how you might cure diseases that are more on the lines of complex, chronic, non-communicable diseases. My background, I've got a BSc in biochemistry and genetics, PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry, and an MBA.
Thanks. Eric?
Thank you. Let's see. This is working here? Okay. So I first became familiar with cannabinoids in the 1980s, I think in the early 80s and the latter part of the 80s, and I'd been a member of the American Chemical Society for, I think, over 23 years now. My most recent experience with cannabinoids began in 2019. I was at the University of Tübingen at the Institute of Organic Chemistry there, and they had a vaping crisis in the United States. And people from the United States had contacted me and asked me what we could do as far as finding safe diluents for THC that was going into these vaping carts. And so, you know, I studied a little bit about the problem, which was lipoid pneumonia at the time, and we began looking into this a little bit. But one day as I was looking at compounds, we pulled into the parking lot of the university, and I looked at the structure of CBD, and then I looked at the structure of THC, and I said, wow, these compounds are so similar, it would be very easy to you know, cyclicize CBD into THC. I don't know, maybe they were doing this in the United States at the time. We looked and we found in the patent literature that other people had done this previously, but we thought, well, we could make a nice solid supported catalyst for doing this and perhaps sell it to licensed companies in the United States. And that was our first business model. We did that, and then we began making derivatives of CBD, prodrugs, and THC, which were water-soluble and had increased bioavailability. And so basically, I would say since that time, we've been focused on making modifications to cannabinoids and novel cannabinoids, and lately I've been directed toward the recreational markets here in Europe and also in the United States. So that's primarily the focus of Tresco Labs, which, as I said...
And your educational background?
Educational background, yeah, my educational background is a Bachelor of Science degree, so I'm not as
decorated. As decorated.
As decorated, yes, as Sebastian is, and who provides such very articulate answers to many of the questions we have to say. I am quite proud of you for that, Sebastian. But I do have a lot of experience in organic synthesis over the years, and that's primarily what I'm focused on. But I have, just like Giovanni, I have spent time at Genentech, where they teach us that the process is the product. Yeah. So, yeah.
So there's a reason why I put this panel together. So essentially, Eric is working out of Frankfurt. You have Gio working out of Florence, and you have Seb, you're working out of north of London?
South of London, but
South
yeah,
of London,
UK.
sorry. Yeah, I had that 50-50. But so essentially, Eric kind of does the molecular side. Seb's looking at the business end, and then certainly Gio's looking at, has technologies as far as separations or inclusions. So I guess starting with you, Gio, what are a few of the things, two, three things that you see most exciting on the near-term horizon, whether it's 12 months, 18 months, that's going to make the most impact, whether we're talking about cannabis, cannabinoids, or something in between?
Okay, thank you. So I think that, also from the questions that I raised to the previous panels, I think that here we are assisting to a bit of dichotomy between, of course, the European market or rest of the world and the US, where the US is let's say, an open lab for experimenting what is interesting from a consumer perspective more than a patient perspective. So I think that if we look at what will be the development of the European sector, maybe in a bit more than 1 year, if some recreational market, for instance, is going to be to open also in Germany, I think that the importance of understanding what the consumer, not only the patient, but also the consumer, and I say patient and consumer and we mentioned today that is the separation between these two concepts is sometimes not easy to make, but what really the consumer wants is important. So my point is that for instance, when I was studying a bit this sector, I went to a pharmacies, and I was looking at the way they were producing the tincture, the cannabinoid tincture, the boiling the dry flower in oil. They were obtaining a tincture that was like smelling of rotten fish. And I asked, but so it smells bad, I mean, and I don't think this is we like. And the answer by the pharmacist was, but that's a medicine, so it doesn't have to taste nice or whatever. So that was the mentality that I found, at least in Italy, 3-4 years ago. And it hasn't changed so much in Italy, at least. So I think that what is important to understand is that the quality and having product that really meet the expectation by the consumer and can be good for them and can be pleasant is also very important, also in the medical sector. So on that regard, I think that, for instance, what we are doing with some partners in California, we are developing this solventless product, which, in my view, represent what the market is demanding for many reasons, because it meets a lot of ESG, let's say, point on the way that the consumer can understand that there is no let's say, organic solvent being used in the production process, and for instance, in a product that he has to inhale, that's something that the consumer is growing a consciousness on what is inhaling, and that's very, very important. So I think, let's say, obtaining products that can be of high quality and can meet the consumer expectations now and the future expectation, I think is very, very important.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, so I think the most exciting thing in the next 2 years, firstly, I want to say that science time is a bit like geological time. It runs way slower than investors or maybe cannabis cultivators would like it to, but that's the nature of the beast. So I can tell you what we're working on that we're fundamentally excited about, and that is a platform for utilizing data science to surface and develop pipelines of biopharmaceutical drugs. Now, historically, we've been focused on THC and CBD fundamentally, and most people in the room today are focused primarily in their knowledge base on those two molecules. There's 100 cannabinoids, there's 23,000 terpenes, there's 10,000 flavonoids out there. Some of those you can get to in high abundance in the plant, some of them you can't. However, what we lack in this industry is the ability to connect the market with the production, and that is fundamentally a question of function in the human body, which we don't yet have a good answer to. So what I'm fundamentally excited about over the next 2 years is the data science that we're doing around correlating plant production or natural abundance with known data in the literature, primarily scientific literature, and our own that we're generating in our labs, and then developing concepts of how we might think about disease, not in the Cartesian model of Alzheimer's, cancer, so on and so forth, but in what are the core common features of those diseases, like dysregulated inflammation and so on and so forth, so that we're designing clinical trials that actually have relevant endpoints for cannabinoid-based medicines or molecules that may be coming out of that same plant. Because if you look at the data, I think there's something like 400 trials, only 40 of them have reported. That means the rest of them have basically flunked and they've not even bothered. Of those, I think 20 are around sort of successful, and most of those are based on CBD. So we're only just scratching the surface of what could be $1 trillion market in the future, but we've got to go and do the legwork to get there. So that's what I'm really excited about, David.
Thanks, Seb. Eric?
Well, what I'm excited about is I speak to people on a daily basis who, in the United States and in Europe, move metric tons of cannabinoids into the marketplace. And so I hear from them every day and every week what's going on in the industry worldwide. And it's a very volatile industry. But I think personally that what we're going to see, and a thing that I'm very excited about and what we're working on, is having materials that are non-psychoactive, that consumers can easily access, but that they can have tools in place to be able to modify these non-psychoactive, completely unregulated compounds, if they want to, into compounds that are, say, for example, CB1 receptor agonists, which are greatly in demand, you know, in the United States and in Europe and in other markets. So I see this really as the way forward, and also as the way forward for marketers, is being able to put tools in the hands of the patients, where the patients can make a decision to, if they want to produce a substance that might be considered controlled in their jurisdiction. And so this is an area that I'm working on every day, and I think this is rather exciting.
Just to add, probably kind of treading the line in between everybody here. So we mentioned earlier, we're a lead sponsor of CanMed. In April, we were able to put on the stage with myself, some of the leading scientists. One of the things that was really interesting that came out of that is having the next killer app, if you will, on cannabis and cannabinoids. So if you live in the States, and especially in Colorado, when you saw in 2012 a lot of people moving to Colorado when it was one of the first legal states, because a lot of mothers and fathers had kids that had epilepsy, and the easiest access was to come to Colorado. As you guys know, mothers and fathers will do anything for their kids. And so that, I think, was the first killer app, if you will, on cannabis or CBD. And I think that's the thing is we're searching for, is what's the next really killer app. And one thing that came out of CanMed that was really interesting, that came out of a conversation on stage with Deddy Myrie and Ethan Rousseau, is they think women's health is going to be one of the next low-hanging fruits for cannabis and cannabinoids. The other thing that I think, touching on Eric's and what Gio's doing, is where this molecular world's going to go as far as making some of these new, I know Eric's said before, one of the main things he's selling here in Europe is HHC, hexahydrocannabinol. So a lot of these miners and the production of those, and then actually trying to find out what those do. Because if you guys, everybody knows here, there's still a stigma. And if we can do more data, get better molecules, more consistent, high quality molecules, we're going to definitely get rid of the stigma. One other question before we put it out. Really talking to all you guys on stage, innovation has not had a lot to do with cannabis. And intellectual property has not had a lot to do with cannabis. So maybe getting to more specific points, Gio, if you want to start off as far as your thoughts on what we can do better with the innovation.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting angle. So, you know, I've been keeping track on patent application in the cannabis space, and I think there has been a pretty interesting ramp up 3-4 years ago on the patent application that were filed every year on different areas. So it's interesting to notice, by the way, that one of the, some of the largest, let's say, some of the companies most active in filing patent applications on cannabinoids and cannabis in general actually were pharma companies, right? So, but at the end, let's say their commercial activity on the field has been, let's say, with exclusion of GW until last year, has been limited, right? So I'm referring to the big pharma companies, big pharma. So despite having some interesting patents around that, they were pretty limited in the commercial exploitation, and that's something that puzzled a bit me. I mean, having a patent protection, but not getting to the market with final product is something that really puzzled me, I think, a lot. I don't have an answer for specific answer for that. There are some ideas. I mean, but if you look at the statistics that have been published earlier, also this year, wherever cannabis has been, legalized to a certain extent, there has been certainly a decrease in opioids consumption, right? And so maybe the simple answer is that allowing, of course, big use of cannabis in the sector would have big impact also on the sales of other products. That's maybe a very simple answer. I don't know if that's correct, but the reality just to comment also the previous point that you were making, David, on the stigma. I mean, I think it's really ridiculous that in opioids prescription is done in such a light and easy manner. I mean, I was personally, let's say, exploring a bit the opioids consumption in pharmacies in my city, Florence, and it's simply crazy. I mean, we are talking about really a percentage of the population that's consuming opioids, and there should be a short period for treatment with opioids, and they once these people they enter the loop, they cannot exit easily. So I found really ridiculous that the doctors then can prescribe and pharmacists can provide opioids in such an easy manner, and there is still a stigma on cannabis. So and actually the length of the treatment, for instance, in Italy, is often made difficult because of the lack of availability of the products to the pharmacies. So it's really strange, and I hope that this will get better.
I got three things on IP. When we started Phytome Life Sciences, we made a very strong decision not to straddle ourselves between production and manufacturing and being a research company. We're 100% a research company focused on the development of intellectual property, the licensing of it, and commercialization of it. I think that's a very important thing to think about. We do not start any wet research unless we've done a patent landscape search, which we have an intellectual property office for. And number three, fundamentally, is if you're not willing to defend a patent, i.e. you've got the cash to do so, do not go and publish everything you know about that process, because someone's going to copy you and you're not going to be able to defend it and you're going to be able to do nothing about it. I hope that's clear enough for everybody in the room what I think about that.
So you were talking about innovation, David, in the cannabis space, and I have to say what I think is interesting is how fast the market has responded to some key peer-reviewed papers that we had on alkyl chain derivatives of, for example, THC. So we had, and these, I think, papers, at least the first one came out of an Italian university, didn't it? With what they called the THC biforol or something, wasn't that? That was the heptyl alkyl chain derivative. So then we began to see in the United States production of THCP, they called it. That was for the heptyl alkyl chain derivative. And then, of course, immediately after that came the HHCP, which was a heptyl chain derivative there. So many people got to know firsthand that these alkyl chain derivatives of the classic cannabinoids could provide a more powerful effect or an equivalent effect with a smaller dose, and that they lasted for a longer period of time. So I think that the consumer base with many of these products has experientially learned how different modifications to these molecules are capable of influencing the perceived central nervous system effect. Yeah, so that's one innovation I've seen.
So,
well, real quick, there was a client of ours, and he'll be talking a little later on, who produced some THCP, and he said he took it and he was high for 3 days. Yeah. So it's fun. It's called fun with chemistry. Yeah, no, one thing real quick, and then I'll kick it over to you guys, then we can kick it to the audience. One thing about intellectual property and IP is if you really knew the GW Pharma Jazz deal, that was really done on, it wasn't done really on Epidiolex, it was done on the IP that GW Pharma had. So, and that's the biggest deal that's really ever been done in the sector. And really, if you look at GW, it's more of a biotech company than a cannabis. But the importance of IP and innovations is only going to grow in the sector for sure.
Yeah, I think just to connect to the point of Sebastian. So we opened our industrial lab in Los Angeles from Florence at the end of last year, and we started to interact a lot with California companies. And I think it's very interesting to notice few things. One is that many producers they try to stay secret about what they are doing in terms of their process, their formulation, because as Sebastian was saying, I mean, it's not easy to file a patent and remain protected and fight for that. And I know at least a couple of cases where actually there has been a patent that has been filed. For instance, one is in the production of THCA diamonds, okay? And the company was a small company, and many others, they started to copy the process. And in the end, he couldn't do anything else that, being acquired by one of the companies that was copying their method, and agree with with a royalty or whatever. But it has been clearly a defeat, okay, on that regard. And also it's interesting the case of GW and Canopy. There has been an IP lawsuit, and probably the end of the lawsuit was a bit unexpected, perhaps in the US. And therefore, it is certainly a double-edged sword, the IP protection. I mean, on our end, we believe that patent protection and innovation patent protection is important. So we filed 5 different patent families, and most of them they have been already granted. So because our model is also based on licensing this technology. But of course, as always, and as in every sector, filing a patent is not sufficient. You have to protect by executing through the execution and deliver the best service or the best product on the market in any case. So the IP protection, I believe, is just a plus.
Seb, anything else?
No, nothing to add on that.
So we'll go, and Guy, we can put it out to the audience for any questions we may have.
Honestly, it was hard for me even to take notes because things that you folks seem to assume is so far over my head. But in the United States recently, as you know, the DEA has granted licenses to a number of cannabis cultivators who are meant to supply product in competition with the much maligned University of Mississippi. And I am curious if anyone on the panel has a sense of how those business models, what kind of business models might develop by having well-funded, DEA-approved, presumably well-regulated, new suppliers of cannabis and cannabinoids into the research space and into pharma. Like, is this a big deal, or is it just TBC?
Do you want me to have a go at that? It is a big deal because it shows intent federally that they want to develop research, and that possibly then opens up grant funding in America, which is still the biggest grant funding capability in the world. So from a research perspective, I think it's fantastic news. And basically Mississippi cannabis was dust that was off the floor, I think, in Mississippi somewhere. So fantastic on that front. In terms of really getting to the molecular level of the issue, I think it provides a generic starting point for questions that are molecular questions, not necessarily biomass or whole flower questions. And so it therefore has a certain limited potential if it's just one strain of cannabis grown to order through a certain federally licensed site. We are much more excited about organizations that can grow small batches of material where you can still do pilot studies, but they're fundamentally thinking about the chemistry and the variable chemistry, possibly in polychemical format, not down to THC, CBD, but maybe it's unique landrace strains or other things that are producing really interesting things that we don't see regularly. That has huge potential to be far more impactful over time than just a generic centralized source of cannabis, but it's a great start for helping the industry get started.
From the Cavill side, yes, it's a big deal. Because, if you look at, so we know a number of these companies. Sue Sisley, who I've known forever, she has a DA license in Arizona. She's doing some interesting things. It also helps on the psychedelic side, but we've talked before. I mean, you heard me earlier. The pharma companies really are not the source of innovation anymore. It's biotech companies. But that has lowered in the US, which is really still the hub of biotech in the world, has lowered the activation energy to get to market. For example, the reason why it's a big deal, BRC, Biotech Research Company, has a DA license in California. Hunter Land, who's a friend of mine, is the head science guy there. They raised $20 million, I think Intrinsic Lab, or Intrinsic Partners led that round. And so the $20 million is a big deal. And then if you look at another of the companies that owns a DA license is Bright Green, they're public on the NASDAQ. So as far as capital, yes, it makes a big deal.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating conversation. I was particularly interested in the data science aspect. So about actually clinical trials. These past couple of years, I had some experience doing clinical trials in cannabis from my PhD research. And as I'm sure you know, stigma still exists in senior scientific boards, like the INCB. It's still an uncertain regulatory landscape for a lot of pharma companies to invest in. So I wanted to ask, what do you think of real-world data as an alternative to formal clinical research? Is it a valid way around the problem? And as a follow-up question, if so, what kind of data should we be collecting? What variables are most important to gather from the real-world use of cannabis, both medical use or otherwise?
Do you want to go?
So, I mean, we are not, as a company, involved in the clinical trials. So we are collaborating with companies that are using our extraction system to produce compounds which can then be used in clinical trials. So a comment that I would like to make is that some months ago there was a research studies that hits the news saying that most of the clinical trials were inconclusive regarding the utilization of cannabinoids for a number of pathologies. So we took a bit of time internally to review these research studies, meta studies, and what we found out, I mean, not being a company specialized in this field, but what we found out is that there was a very interesting correlation, let's say, between the studies that found cannabinoids to be effective with the subadministration method. So what I want to say is that apparently the inhalation is way more effective than other ways, and I think that aspect for cannabis, again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physician, but that's what we found. So we reviewed the 20-30 studies that were considered in that meta-analysis, and clearly there was a strong correlation between the inhalation and the effectiveness of the treatment.
I think it's really helpful. I think the challenge is that the retrospective work, where you have no handle at all on what the user is taking and possibly getting a beneficial therapeutic effect, is quite limited. So we're about to run a pilot actually in a cohort of chronic inflammatory disorder. I won't tell you what it is, but it's a chronic inflammation, where we are going to be working with a major university in the UK to collect the material they're actually using, alongside collecting the, if you like, the clinical data or the questionnaire feedback, to do the chemical analyses of the material they're using, and then using data science, to your point, to be able to look for signals in those data. So I think it has huge potential. We've been doing it for decades. It's called ethnobotany. We've just been doing it in the Peruvian jungles and places like that. But hey, it's time for us to bring it into the Western world and start doing it here too.
Just to add a counterpoint on that, I'm assuming if you're talking real world data, you're talking non-clinical trials that are out, kind of like a phase 4 trial. Yeah, I think it's great. The more data we have, the better it is to get rid of the stigma. On the negative side, we know a group that was asked by Mitch McConnell and the FDA to evaluate CBD and CBD toxicity with a range of different products in the US. And they came up with some really interesting findings, one of them being that CBD is not that dangerous and actually had beneficial effects on diabetes. And they sent that into the FDA. Guess what the FDA did? They buried it. So frankly speaking, our thought is if you really want to do real science on cannabis and cannabinoids, go to Australia or do it in Israel. Don't do it in the US, because I think the FDA right now is abdicating their leadership in the role, if you really want to know my opinion.
Sita Schubert, European... Yeah, hello? Okay. Sita Schubert, European Medicinal Cannabis Association. I think the point is, you know, to look for opportunities in science is not so difficult. Before the allowance of the German law, BfArM, who is known as one of the strictest rapporteurs in any kind of registration process, already made an allowance for 44 indications to get it on a special permission imported. So I think the roadmap where to go is there. I think what we are missing is, as a cannabis industry, is to understand ourselves as part of the pharmaceutical industry and to figure out the regulatory path and the dosage finding, because I think this is where we are lacking data due to the prohibition for a long time. And here I think there will be no avoidance of coalitioning in somebody who is knowing the regulatory path and the clinical trial path. And I think the 44 indications are unmet medical need. So anything what you can provide in this area will be more than welcome by the EMA, by BfArM, not BfArM, because they're all strict conditions. You go to the EMA and you get 26 markets. So I think it's not as difficult as we might think.
Yeah, I agree fundamentally with you. I think it's challenging when, so that process already exists. It's how pharmaceuticals are developed, and you're saying the same thing, and I agree with you on that. I think it is a problem when we just decide that cannabis is going to be relevant to X number of conditions because we kind of like it. That's not a very scientific process. So I would suggest that we need to be a little bit more open-minded in understanding the fundamentals of how the biochemistry and the pharmacokinetics of the molecules work, which we still don't understand, before we just go and put a blanket, those 44 other ones, don't think about anything else, because you might fundamentally be missing an enormous opportunity left field, which you just don't look at.
It works. It does work. A number of questions were asked in previous panelists. What's the most important thing that could be done for the cannabis sector? And I think you guys sitting up there, you've nailed it. Basically, it's the science that increases the knowledge that reduces the stigma. So the question is this: is the stigma still going to be here in 4 years' time? Or do you think the actions that you're taking now will have removed that stigma within that 4 years? And if not, how can we improve the removal of stigma so that it is gone in 4 years?
I'll say real quick, I mean, just 2 examples. It depends on geography, John. I mean, if you look at Malaysia, and anybody, especially Australia, knows about Malaysia, they have capital punishment for anybody with any amount of cannabis, any drug, right? or the fact here, if you're in Germany and you go to Bavaria, Bavaria is still not very keen on cannabis. So I think the stigma and how long it lasts is going to be geographically determined.
So I have, maybe wrongfully, but I have big hope in the completion of the assessment in the US at the base of the eventual decision for rescheduling. So I believe that, if the final outcome that is supposed to happen by the end of the year is going to provide the basis for an effective, for real, rescheduling, let's say above class 3, I expect that to have a big impact. Because in the end, at least on the Western world, the influence of the U.S. In many manner, the same manner that prohibition has been kind of exported, I think maybe that the same type of opposite trend can occur. So I really hope that this assessment is sufficiently clear to provide the basis for the DEA to reschedule cannabis. I see that as a major milestone. If that will not occur, I think many other countries, like I'm talking about, for instance, Italy, we are really far from eliminating the stigma, but really, really far. And the stigma is also present still in California. I mean, so we have a local team there, and some managers, even in California, they are avoiding to mention what their job is when they go to the school. Like that's the situation in California. So in Europe or in Italy, it's not possible in 4 years, I see.
Go.
If I can add a comment. So I work in Europe's third largest chemical park, which is Hoechst. And I can tell you that many of the world's top custom chemical manufacturers, right? And for example, one of them, a pharmaceutical company, Sanofi, divested their fine chemicals production to a company they call EuroAPI. And EuroAPI are my neighbors. And I was speaking with them about doing some work on some cannabinoids that's, perfectly regulatory compliant, but they still feel a stigma with these. It's like, and one of the answers that they gave me one time is, well, they had just gone public, been listed on the German stock exchange, and they thought they didn't want to have anything to do with any chemistry that touched upon cannabinoids. And that includes even, CBD. They didn't want to do anything with CBD because there's still that stigma involved. So I can say that large German chemical manufacturers, at least, there's still too much of a stigma involved for them to become involved with these types of compounds.
Can I respond to your question before you ask another one, just really quickly? Okay. I think anything that verges on a religious experience or a mystical experience, which cannabinoids, psychedelics may do, is always going to have a stigma associated with it, with those who are looking to control the populace. And therefore, I think education of yourself so that you understand how to use that medicine beyond the medical practitioner is going to be a big part of how actually this becomes destigmatized and repatriated into the hands of the people who can treat themselves with it.
Well put, Sebastian.
Thank you.
Just one point or more. You mentioned, sorry, can you hear me now? Yes. So 1 point more. I was in Singapore last week. We're looking at doing research there. I was in Malaysia. We're looking at doing research there. So these Asian countries are moving along, despite them hanging somebody in Singapore 6 weeks ago, right? We already operate in 5 countries, so USA, Canada, UK, Germany, Australia, and funnily enough, Jamaica. So the biggest problem we face around the world is stigma. you guys have nailed it, but we have to actually work together to overcome that stigma. That's the one thing I think out of this whole forum that we need to actually grasp. Overcome the stigma, the rest of it will follow.
Thank you so much. Let's hear it for the panel.